On the 1st of February 2021, Myanmar's military forces initiated a coup. The military had claimed that the recent national election in November 2020 was fraudulent. Despite these claims, the military never brought forward any evidence. A state of emergency was declared which would last for 1 year. General Min Aung Hlaing set up a junta that would be known as the State Administration Council. High-profile officials such as Myanmar's leader Aung San Suu Kyi were arrested. While this happened, Myanmar's military began to block access to social media platforms. The extreme violence used by Myanmar's military over the past year would shock many around the globe. Despite this shock, not much has been done to stop it. The people of Myanmar seem to have been forgotten. Before we can begin looking at the coup itself, we must first look back at the history of Myanmar and its continuous problem with democracy. Before the country was known as Myanmar, it was known as Burma. Burma was a part of the British Empire. During the Second World War, Burma became a challenging and deadly part of the campaign, as the British Raj, US and China tried to push back against Japan's expansionism. Not long after the Second World War, in 1948, Britain handed Burma their independence. There was struggle in Burma during this period that saw many uprisings by ethnic groups, as well as several attempts of power grabbing by communist groups, who were often being supported by China. All of this began to worry Myanmar's armed forces, who were concerned that this could end up dividing the nation's ethnic groups. These worries led to a coup in 1962, in which the army seized control of the government and installed their own leader, Ne Win. Burma now became a one-party communist state. The party in charge from this point onwards was known as the Burma Socialist Programme Party, or the BSPP. For 16 years, the nation remained this way. However, this began to change in 1988. Burma was a financial mess, with the country becoming one of the poorest. Young people, many of whom were students, began to clash with the police, protesting against the government system. These protests would be known as the 8888 uprising. Protests began to grow but were violent. This began to change when one of these protesters, Aung San Suu Kyi, brought everyone together, pleading for protesters to remain peaceful. It was this way of thinking that would lead Aung San Suu Kyi to being awarded the Nobel Prize in 1991. It was during the 8888 uprising that Aung San Suu Kyi set up her party known as the National League for Democracy, or the NLD. In September of 1988, a referendum was held in Congress to decide whether or not the country would implement a multi-party system. 90% of delegates voted in favour of this. the BSPP refused. Instead, there was a coup initiated by the State Law and Order Restoration Council, or SLORC, led by Sormang. SLORC used extreme violence to stop all protests. They did this by shooting anyone who dared protest against them. The estimated number of dead stands at 10,000. The nation was now a junta. To clarify, a junta is a government ran by military officers. The junta placed Aung San Suu Kyi under house arrest, something that would continue for the next 30 years. It was also at this time that Burma now became known as Myanmar. In 1990, the junta held an election in which the NLD won 80% of the vote. However, SLORC ignored the result and continued to rule. In 1997, however, SLORC was absolved and was renamed the State Peace and Development Council. Not much changed after this. The financial situation in Myanmar continued to worsen. Eventually, in 2008, the junta declared that Myanmar would begin its process towards becoming a democratic state. The interesting thing to note here is that the SDPC established the Union Solidarity and Development Association that would go on to become the Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP. This is of course important when observing how the military tried to hold on to power. In 2010, an election was held. However, there was much speculation as to whether or not this election would be fairly ran. Many began to worry about it becoming fraudulent, and as a result, Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD boycotted the election. The DVNP won with 80% of the vote, effectively keeping the military in power. It also meant that despite the excitement, Myanmar never got their fair election. Finally, in 2015, Myanmar had its first proper election. However, Aung San Suu Kyi was not allowed to stand for the presidency and instead would hold the position of state councillor. Tin Chaw would instead run for president. The National League for Democracy won in a landslide victory. However, despite this, and all the promises made of moving towards a democratic society, the military still held a lot of power. This is due to how the parliamentary system works. There is a lower house and an upper house. In the lower house, there are 440 MPs. Out of those 440, 330 of those are elected. However, 110 of those are instead appointed by the Myanmar Armed Forces. In other words, the Myanmar military control 25% of the seats in Parliament. In the upper house, out of 224 MPs, 128 are elected, and once again 56 of those are chosen by the military. This does not paint the full picture of just how much control the military has. This is because, on top of this, the military has a lot of money. This is mainly due to the strong links they have with businesses. The NLD did not want to share power with the military, as they believed in creating a free democracy. The military became increasingly concerned that the NLD may be looking at ways to get rid of their influence in Parliament. This was an area of concern for many of the military's officers, as they were worried about the actions they had taken against the Rohingya people. The Rohingya people are mainly made up of a Muslim population, leading many to accuse the Myanmar military of genocide. The military have also been accused of many war crimes and human rights abuses. High-ranking military officers are worried that without the political power they have, they will be open to criminal charges. In fact, even the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi have been criticised for not standing up to the military for these actions. An interesting thing to note is during the build-up to the last election, the military general Min Aung Hlaing has been looking to become a political figurehead. he was hoping to eventually become president of Myanmar. In 2020, Myanmar had its latest election, with the NLD winning 396 seats, meaning that the NLD had won an absolute victory. The military-supported USDP, however, had lost seats, only managing to secure 33. This meant that the military had lost almost all of its power in government. To add to this, Min Aung Hlaing's want to become president looked increasingly unlikely. It was after this victory that Myanmar's military began claiming that the election was fraudulent. They began writing to the Union Election Committee requesting they investigate. This rhetoric by the military continued for a number of months. During this time, no evidence was ever brought forward to confirm these allegations. The Myanmar military, feeling that the election was not valid, now decided that they must take action. On February the 1st, Min Aung Hlaing led the coup against the NLD. One could say it was the beginning of the end to democracy in Myanmar. NLD MPs were placed under house arrest, and at the same time, the military began to place personnel onto the streets. While this was happening, the military made sure to block access to social media platforms, with the intention to block citizens from reaching out to the rest of the world. It is interesting that this happened, as if the military truly believed what they were doing was right, and that the vote was fixed. Why block everyone's social media? If the military believed that the vote was fixed, this implies that in reality, not that many people voted for the NLD. Why would they feel the need to block access to social media to those who would surely agree with what they are doing? The military's actions make no sense. The military leadership called a state of emergency and claimed that this would last for a year. What should be kept in mind here is that no evidence was ever given to support their arguments, and even to this day, no evidence has ever been brought forward. Yet no real action has been taken to stop them. A day later, on February the 2nd, protests began to start, with thousands going out into the streets to bang pots and pans and honk their horns. On February the 3rd, health workers walked out and began a civil disobedience campaign. Over the coming days, protests would continue to grow. By the 5th of February, other professions such as teachers joined the civil disobedience campaign. At the same time, the junta shut down access to the internet for the public. These protests continued to grow in numbers, with the military deciding that they must take action. Over the coming weeks, the military would break multiple human rights laws and leave many dead. The military response to these protests was very violent and excessive. This is no shock, especially when we look to how these protests were dealt with in the past. The national community watched in shock. The US did impose sanctions and warned that if the coup continued, these sanctions would get worse. As we now know, the US response did nothing to stop the violence. The police and military shot at protesters and beat many excessively. I cannot show these images, as I do not have the rights to them, but there are numerous videos on YouTube that show protesters being beaten with rifles repeatedly. It should be stated that the military believe that what they are doing is right. The police began to search homes and arrest anyone who was considered a leader within the protests. In fact, by the 21st of February, 640 people had already been arrested. It is very obvious that this has nothing to do with protecting the nation, and instead has been for the self-interest of officers. To show how little the people meant to the junta, a girl named Kiao Sin, who was shot by the armed forces, was exhumed by the military after her burial, although they claimed that this was done to prove that they had not shot her. It is ironic that they did this, as there is plenty of evidence that they have shot directly at protesters multiple times. The death toll continued to rise, and by March the 16th, 202 people had been killed, with 2,181 people being arrested. It should be noted that thousands more would have been beaten severely. Furthermore, it should also be noted that not all military personnel and police officers took part in this violence. Some joined the protesters, and others fled as they refused to follow the orders given to them by their superiors. It was over the next few months that the number of deaths and human rights violations by the military would increase. One of the worst death tolls occurred on March the 27th, which also happened to be Armed Forces Day. The military, continuing their crackdown, shot at protesters, killing 160 people, although the number of deaths is most likely higher. To add to this, on March the 28th, the armed forces launched airstrikes on the Karen state. 3,000 people fled their villages to go to Thailand. Karen is largely controlled by an insurgent group. However, is this the right course of action to take against your own people? By the 1st of November, the number of dead was at least 1,200, with an estimated 75 of these being children. To this day, the number of dead continues to grow, and the violence does not seem close to ending. The junta declared, even despite their supposed one-year national state of emergency, that they would keep power until 2023. After looking through the history of Myanmar, how many times has this been promised, and how often has this been seen through correctly? To this day, 2,265 people have been killed, with a further 15,353 being arrested. The violence is continuous, but nothing seems to be being done. The NLD leadership have been arrested on false charges, and to add to this, 4 politicians were executed in July of 2022. I am sure that these politicians will not be the last executions. Sanctions seem to be the West's new way of dealing with aggression, but from what I have seen so far, it does not seem to be working. The unfortunate truth is that despite the sanctions placed on Myanmar, the number of dead continues to grow. In reality, the people of Myanmar seem to have been forgotten, with many of them still fighting for their freedom. However, with the Chinese foreign minister pledging to have closer ties with the Myanmar military, and more recently, Min Aung Hlaing meeting with Putin, one must question whether or not the people can fight against a junta seemingly backed by great powers. With the West seemingly focused elsewhere, all we can do is make sure the people of Myanmar are not forgotten.